So now what we're going to do is we want to provide a model of the process itself of reviewing your literacy assessments. And to that end, we are really lucky to have some reading specialists today who are going to help us model the process. So the one thing that we do want to point out here is that although we're modeling really a one-to-one conversation, that the process would not be a one-to-one conversation. So it might look or feel or sound something more like a coaching conversation, when in reality there would be many more stakeholders around the table to engage in this process of a literacy assessment review. So at this time I'm going to take a moment and ask our guest reading specialist to introduce herself and to let us know what grade level she's representing today.
Okay, my name is Anne-Marie Hillman. I'm a reading specialist and literacy coach at Central High School in Westosha. And we are a union high school, so we are only a high school for the whole district. I work with grades 9 through 12.
Great. And so, Anne-Marie, we are really excited to have you with us today, and thank you so much to you and to your school district for sharing. Yeah, absolutely. So you can see here on our document that we would begin by filling in just some kind of contextual information at the top, the grade levels, the team members who we have engaging in the discussion with us. And again, hopefully we're well represented to break down our silos in our schools, as well as the assessments. So first, I want to begin by asking you, Anne-Marie, what kinds of literacy or reading assessments do you administer at the 9-12 level in your school?
Sure, we've got quite a few. When the kids are coming in at a 9th grade level, we look at the WKCE scores on the reading, or now we're switching over to the ACT suite, so we look at Aspire and Explore at the 10th grade level, and then ACT at the 11th grade level to look at the standardized assessments. And then with the individual students that I work with, we do a number of assessments. We do the informal reading inventory, or the IRI. Sometimes I've used the qualitative reading inventory, or the QRI. We use a modification of AimsWeb with our students who are on the SLD route of RTI. And then we also use the Scholastic Reading Inventory, or SRI, for some of the progress monitoring of the reading class.
Great, thanks. So if we're really doing a comprehensive review of all of our literacy assessments, then what we would do is we would answer our questions about each one of those. For the sake of time, and because we're just modeling the process, we're just going to zero in on one of those assessments. So which one of those assessments do you want to talk more about today?
I think for me, the most important one is the informal reading inventory, because that's the one that actually provides me the information that I use for my own instruction and that I pass on to other teachers as well.
Great.
And I have more to say on that, but I know that we'll get to it on a lot of the questions.
Sure. Great. And our questions are really broken down into different categories, as we've already talked about. And you can see here that that's reflected in our document itself. So we have questions around the topic of administration of the assessment, questions around the constructs and format. Rolling down, we have some questions about the content of the assessment itself, questions about the result, the uses, and communication. So those are our different categories. And I'm just going to start right at the top here. And we're just going to capture our notes in the notes section of this document. And again, our viewers have access to a clean template of this document that they could use or modify for their own context and purpose. So, at what grade level do you administer the informal reading inventory?
It's used at all 4 grade levels, 9 through 12. Mm-hmm. However, most of my kids I catch as freshmen, so it's primarily for 9th graders.
Okay, Great. And who exactly takes this assessment?
The students have been identified or referred by teachers, sometimes counselors, or even sometimes their parents as possibly having reading difficulties. Or they'll come with referrals from the feeder schools who had them in 8th grade.
Okay. And when is the assessment window?
Well, ideally, I like to get the assessments done within the first 6 weeks of the school year.
Mm-hmm.
But in reality, as soon as I get students, so I tend to, because some students we don't identify for a couple of weeks, or sometimes I get them transferred somewhat lately. So it seems like it's almost a rolling enrollment that they end up taking the test.
Okay, so your goal is for those existing students somewhere during the first 6 weeks, or when they perhaps enter your system.
Exactly.
Okay, and how long does this particular assessment take to administer?
Generally, it takes about 30 minutes.
Mm-hmm. And how is this assessment administered? So, for example, is this web-based? Does it need to be one-on-one? Is it an oral assessment, paper and pencil?
It's a one-on-one, and it's oral.
Okay. And so my follow-up question, thinking about time and the context here in the administration, are students then pulled from a class to be given this assessment, or how does that work?
Generally, if they're in my class already, I pull them from my class while my aide continues to teach. Mm-hmm. Or if they're kids that have been referred to me, I try to pull them from a study hall whenever possible. But if they don't have a study hall, then I'll arrange with the teachers. I'll email the list of the teachers that student has and ask when it would be appropriate to pull a student.
And so could we call that, if they have a course with you, could we call that, what would we call that, an intervention kind of period, or?
Yeah, it's a tier 2.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a tier 2 intervention.
Okay. And would they be pulled from an English language arts course then? I think that.
Not necessarily.
Or not necessarily.
No,
okay.
It's whichever. I email the teachers and I ask them, would it be convenient, would it, or not, for me to pull this student sometime today. And the teachers will respond if they have a test or if they have important notes, please don't pull them. Or if they know that they can make it up, then they say that would be fine.
Okay, great. Thank you. And what are the financial costs associated with this assessment?
Well, I guess it would be the cost of the original book, which my district purchased, so I have it right here. The informal reading inventory is, I think the manual costs a little bit over $100, and then just the cost of printing the pages, because it is paper-based.
And because you're the one administering this, this is part of your duties and responsibilities. So we don't need additional staffing costs, but this is part of your staffing cost as well. And so what kind of training is required to administer the assessment? Could anybody give this assessment?
Well, I learned how to do it as part of my 316 licensure.
Mm-hmm.
So, that involved, learning about the informal inventories and practicing it was volunteers. And quite a lot of hours of practice first, as well as reading the manual. So I'm sure anybody could do it, but they would need training. I actually am training my special education department here how to give the test, but then they'll still need my help in interpreting the results.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we'll talk about interpreting the results a little bit later, but that's a very good point. So definitely someone who is a licensed reading teacher, district reading specialist, or someone who has been trained by one of those folks. Okay, so next we'll move on to just kind of the constructs and the format. So is this, what can you tell me about the assessment? Is this a criterion referenced or norm reference assessment?
It's a criterion reference. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. And so just as a follow-up then, to what extent is the assessment technically adequate? What would you say are the or the reliability and validity of this assessment?
Sure. I actually, because I looked at these questions in advance, so I went ahead and I went into the appendix of the manual that describes how the inventory was constructed, and so it describes the process in detail. So I would say the validity is very high, especially they mentioned specifically the face validity. This is the eighth edition of this. So all of the items have been tested and tweaked and replaced as needed by the professors who have used it. And they've used it with a number of classrooms at different grade levels, and also had their graduate students check it as well.
And I think that that's a very good point, that in order to answer that question, you really needed to go somewhere and find out more information. And so I think that that's a really important point.
Yeah, I know that most of the assessments will have a section, if you look through the manuals, where they address those points.
Yeah, absolutely. So our next question is about the types of questions. So do we have selected response? Is there some kind of a performance task? So is it all multiple choice? What are the types of questions on this assessment?
Sure. They're open response, because the students are asked the question, and then I wait for their answers. They've just read a passage, and then the questions follow different patterns. This might be telling you a little bit more than you want right now. You know what? I'll wait and give you the details under content.
Okay.
So is that sufficient?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Yep. In fact, so we can skip right there. And so tell me, what exactly does this assessment measure when we skip ahead to those content questions?
Sure. Something I really like about the IRI is that the types of questions are linked. So for each passage, the students will read it, usually silently, and then they'll turn it over, and I ask them the sets of questions. And so the first one's always a main idea. Can they summarize what they've read? And then there are questions about vocabulary, attention to details, inferencing, sequence, and cause and effect.
Okay. So it's really just measuring particular components of the skill of reading. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, it's measuring comprehension skills.
Okay.
I rarely have students who have decoding issues. It actually has the potential, because you can do miscue analysis if you need to. I have occasionally done that with some of the special education students that I've tested.
Okay.
But comprehension tends to be our main focus.
Okay, great. And that probably makes sense for the grade level that we're really addressing here. And so, would you be able to tell me which academic standards this assessment aligns to?
Yeah. Like I say, I'm glad that I got to look at the questions in advance so I could look and see for sure, because of course I reference my standards frequently, but I don't have them memorized. So, yeah, not yet.
And that's okay.
So when we're looking at them, I tend to go to the Common Core, and so they really connect to the first three standards in the Common Core. They're looking at evidence to support what the text says explicitly, as well as inferences for the first one. The second one is that central idea and summarizing. And then the third one really focuses on sequence and then relationships, so cause and effect.
And would you say the passages are primarily literary text or informational text, since that's something that the Common Core distinguishes between?
Sure. They vary. They're both. They do tend to be more narrative. That's one difference I found with the QRI that I liked better, was that they, like you said, they had the disciplinary literacy text, but they didn't break down the elements of comprehension as well, and it takes longer. So.
Okay. When are the results available after you administer this assessment? How long does it take you to score or to get a student's results?
Sure. At this point, it usually takes me about 15 minutes to score.
15, 1-5?
Yep.
Okay.
It can, if I do the miscue analysis, that takes a little bit longer, but like I say, that's rare. And then it would be only maybe 20 minutes.
Okay. And how do you store the results? How do you keep track of the results? For example, do you keep some kind of a data warehouse? Is there some kind in a grade book, in a portfolio?
Sure. I have a Google document. That's my student roster where I keep information about the students. And so that becomes several of the columns. You know, when I gave the test, the numeric results, and then I do a qualitative analysis of the students' strengths and weaknesses and suggestions for instruction. And then that also, I make a short note of the results on our online gradebook so that other teachers can see that when they're looking at that particular student.
Great. Can this data be disaggregated by subgroup at all?
You know, I think in my data I have grades. That would really be the only way because I don't take demographic information.
So that's not necessarily something that's appropriate with this assessment.
Right, because it's a small scale. I know all the kids that I'm assessing.
Okay, great. So now we'll skip down to the uses. So does this assessment serve as a screener or formative assessment? Thinking about our assessment continuum of a balanced assessment system, where might you place this particular assessment?
Yeah, I was thinking about this question because this is my pre and post testing. So I don't know if, I think I would describe it as the universal screener and then the summative. I think that's how those would align.
Okay, so you're using it as a pre and post test. You're using it, as a screener to get more.
It's my diagnostic as well. I get a lot of information about the students' needs and their strengths.
Great. Yep. Diagnostic. Great. And what systems and structures are in place to support the use of this data? So here, I'm really thinking about how the information is shared, how you collaborate with other folks around the results in order to guide instruction, make decisions about what's appropriate for students.
Sure. They get used a couple different ways. They're the basis for a lot of my class. So the results will determine where in our vocabulary program I start students, where in the spelling program, and then highlight some of the skills that students need extra practice on for reading strategies. That's from my class. And then I share the results with the teachers that have those students so that they get a sense of how they're going to operate in the regular content area classrooms. And then I also share the results when I test the special education students, and that becomes part of their IEP plans and ideas, instructional suggestions for working with them.
And I'm wondering about what kind of systems and structures you have in place to share the results with other teachers. So for example, do you do that in some kind of a PLC setting? Do you have some kind of designated time to do that? Does this happen at a before school or after school meeting? When and how do those conversations happen?
Yeah, they're mostly online. We're a one-to-one, and so everybody's online all the time. Otherwise, we do some with the special education teachers. I tend to arrange a time to go in and work with them during their prep periods. Okay,
great. And so I'm also thinking about Title I or ELL programming. Are there structures in place to collaborate with those programs as well, if that's appropriate?
Yeah, well, we we tend to have a very, very small ELL population, so they tend to also be in my class, and as well as Title I. So I have the students already, so there isn't a separate program for them.
Yeah. So you really are that program, those programs.
That's right. Yep.
Yep, and that is completely understandable. So you talked about this a little bit, but how do you use that information to inform curriculum decisions?
Sure. Some of the information that we can get from the IRI is an estimation of the grade level of the student's reading. And so that can help. You know, I mentioned how I use it in my class. It also can help with the teachers in the regular classrooms when they get a sense of how they can modify and how they can level the text, you know, or use modified text with certain students. It also gives us a sense of which of the students are going to need extra help when it comes to parts of the testing or the papers and such, and so where they're going to need help from the classroom teacher or the teacher aides, or even with me in my classes or before and after school.
So I heard you say a couple different things there. So it sounds like the results here not only inform the actual instruction that happens during that intervention time, but it also informs the kinds of perhaps text selection or supports that are offered at the universal level in other content area classrooms, as well as guiding any kind of decision making about potential supports for assessments as well in that universal content area instruction.
Yeah, I think that's very accurate.
Okay, and so so it sounds like it's really more about this kind of individual level. So do you use it at all for kind of bigger programmatic decisions or curricular decisions, taking kind of that 20,000 foot view at all?
Not really, because it is very individual. I don't ever aggregate. It's powerful on the individual level.
Yep, absolutely, and that makes sense for this type of assessment. Yeah. Okay. Are there any other ways that the data is used and applied?
Well, we also, when we do have students who are referred for special education now, going under the SLD rule, they get sent to my class, and so I do this as the pre-test before we do our other progress monitoring. That's the only other one that comes to mind. So
you use this data in the process of perhaps significant learning disability eligibility process as a part of that process. And we'll focus more on that process in a separate webinar, but that's important to note here. So our last kind of area of focus here is on communication. So you talked a little bit about how the results are shared between and amongst educators. So I'm also wondering, we didn't really talk about between grade levels. So are there any kind of systems and structures in place to share this data in a meaningful way with educators of different grade levels?
Sure. I just wanted to warn you that a bell is about to go off.
No problem. No problem.
So at our high school, we don't have teachers who only teach one grade level. So the teachers I'm talking to, they might. Now we have an announcement.
That's okay. No problem.
The teachers tend to teach multiple grade levels. So, but I go into the PLCs when they're meeting every other week. It's not necessarily on this information, but that's something of what I might share with them to let them know what kind of work we're doing and what's available. Yeah. So that's really, but that's departments more than grade levels.
Okay, so the information is also shared with departments, which leads to additional grade levels. How is the information shared with administrators?
Well, I do want to qualify. We're not that small of a school.
Mm-hmm.
We're 1,200 students.
Okay.
So but I see that, and it's like, well,
Yeah.
we're just because we're a union high school.
Got it. Thank you.
Sure. So for administration, I tend to talk face-to-face with the curriculum director about these. I also, as needed, I share, what I do is I will pull a particular student out of the Google spreadsheet that I have the data stored with,
Mm-hmm.
and I'll put just that one person into a different spreadsheet and share that with people.
Mm-hmm.
That way I'm still protecting the information of the other students.
Yeah, and I think that that's a very important point here, that idea of protecting student data. So that's
Yeah.
always a very critical piece, consideration that we need to take. And so why would you share the information with your curriculum director?
Well, for her to get a sense of how the program's going,
Mm-hmm.
because this is a new thing. I've been working here, this is my second year, and I designed this program when I got here. So, she evaluates me, so this is part of what I can share with her that shows where the program's going well and where we might need to make improvements.
Yeah, so this is really kind of that kind of 20,000 foot view. This is where that would happen. That makes sense.
Okay.
Yeah. And how do you communicate the results with the students themselves and their families?
With the students, I try to be very careful about not telling them, I don't want to discourage them.
Mm-hmm.
So I never share the actual grade level that it indicates, but I give them a sense of where they might need practice, and where they're going to need help. And so we focus on which skills and ways that they can show improvement, with the skills. So, like, for example, we've been working on summarizing as we're reading. And so they've been doing annotating like crazy for the last month or so. And so what I'm working on right now is we have an assessment they just did where they could show mastery of that skill. And if you remember on the IRI, the first question is the main idea question. So that's the summarizing skill.
Right. Great. And so it really leads you to be able to set some goals with students and give them some ideas of some concrete strategies that they can use. And so then how about that bigger families piece? How are you able to communicate with families around this data?
We have a lot of communication with our families. I have a limited number of students, so I'm pretty close to most of the families.
Mm-hmm.
Most of them I email because that's honestly a lot quicker.
Yep.
And I can get to a lot more of them. But then I have some parents that don't have emails or aren't comfortable on computers and such, so I call some of them. I've set up reports. I'll write a different reading report. I take it out of the spreadsheet and just put it into like a prose text that just says basically what I see, what the strengths are, and what the areas for improvement are. And I've sent those to parents so that they can get a sense of if they want to be in this program, if they want to take their student or their child to get testing from the doctor, or if they want, or if they also, those are the main things, for outside testing or psychological testing or such, that helps. Or even if they just want to know themselves.
Yeah, that's great. And I think that that's such an important piece, and that idea of communicating with families, both the strengths as well as some concrete strategies that students can engage in order to improve whatever area of whatever skill within reading you might be working on.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so Anne-Marie, I really want to thank you so much for your time today, and again, you can see that this is just one example of working the process. And now what we would do is really take this information and reflect on it as a whole, and where do we identify maybe there's a particular place where we want to focus to improve our system. Thinking about our literacy system, assessment system as a whole, Maybe there's, for example, maybe we just want to focus on that communication piece or the uses piece. So that's what we would do from here, is really just look at trends. And of course, we would be looking at more than just one literacy assessment. We'd be taking a look at multiple forms of literacy. So thank you so much for your time today, Anne Marie, and we really appreciate the 9-12 perspective, as well as hearing right from one of our Wisconsin school districts.
All right, well, thank you so much for asking me, Laura.
Absolutely.